Today I'm here in Copenhagen by Frederiksberg Castle, one of the palaces the Danish royal family used to own. I think it's a military base right now. And there is a reason why I'm talking about historical monarch and ruling families of Europe. And today we're going to examine the paper titled Queens by Dube and Harish. Basically, the paper aims to examine the question, which gender of ruler is more peaceful? Is there a difference between men and women when it comes to the amount of wars that they're in or start? And this question was posed to me in my development economics class in my final year of university. And pretty much everybody immediately goes, no, male leaders are for sure more aggressive and there'd be more wars. And that's kind of off the basis that men are statistically more aggressive, which is correct. But basically, this is using the case of historical medieval Europe and trying to see if kings or queens are involved in more or less wars, and trying to link it back to how can we analyze institutions and the leaders of institutions and how they impact development. Because obviously there are definitely negatives associated with conflict in terms of economic output and other factors. So let's dive right in. Without a doubt, institutions are heavily impacted by the leaders that govern them. And one of the biggest things that leaders have a say in is their foreign policy of the country or institution. And currently, if we think about foreign policy, it's about all the stuff that's covered in the news, especially on the run-up to elections, like trade agreements and views on other country and protectionism and all those types of things. But during the 15th century to the 20th century, when this study took place, the main thing that leaders looked at when foreign policy was in question was wars. Because if you know anything about European history or a little bit, it's like a million wars all following each other and just constantly battling, and it was pretty crazy, and historians love it. But basically, now that we know leaders have a massive impact on what wars they go into, does the gender of the leader matter in terms of the wars? And this is what they were trying to estimate. But the problem is, it's quite difficult to come up with an empirical strategy that's fair between men and women during that time and only analyzing gender versus war. Because, due to the patriarchal society, women had less chance to be rulers. They weren't, their coming into power at the same time as men wasn't always as equal, So it was pretty hard for them, and this is probably the best part about the paper, is understanding how they can use, empirical strategy and little bits and bobs of econometrics to find purely the difference between gender when we're looking at conflict. And so I'm just going to run through how they kind of went about this, because it's really interesting, and it also helps when thinking about the results. How can you effectively estimate the difference between gender of leaders when it comes to conflict? Well, the first thing that they did was only using cases of hereditary succession, basically meaning they only used countries and polities that their leaders were determined by kind of a birthright to rule. So, the rule of succession was passed down through families, through either, going from a brother to another brother if he didn't have any heirs, or a brother, like a main king, down to his children. And they used that because of selection bias. So if they used all leaders throughout this time period, there wouldn't be equal footing and equal ground for a queen and a king to come to power, because a queen coming to power might have other external, internal factors coming into play. So if they use hereditary succession, it's kind of like almost making it random, because the gender of the child is random. And we'll get on to whether or not hereditary succession is an even predictor of a king or a queen coming into power in a second. And the second thing they used to really just specify the leader's want and the leader's gender want for conflict was the time period of the study they used. So the study starts in 1480 and goes all the way to 1913. And this is significant because in 1913, it's kind of the end of an era of a hereditary succession monarch being able to decide if their country goes to war. So if we think about the wars after 1913, like the Second World War, we tend to see a general pattern of monarchs and rulers by birth determining a country's foreign policy. So it's not like the royal family in England decided to go to war in World War II. No, it was the Prime Minister. So by cutting off there, you're basically isolating the time frame in which a leader has a direct say in what conflicts they go into. And now we kind of think that the leader has an equal footing because there's no selection bias. And this leads to the pinnacle of the paper, and the reason why I really wanted to go into it is their instrumental variable strategy. So a big word, but it basically just means, and I covered it in another video, it kind of just goes on the fact that if your X variable, in this case gender, is not random, so, a queen and a king coming to power is not like an even footing, it's not 50-50, it's not based on the gender birth-sex ratio, which is kind of the case you would think. Queens were less likely to come to power in this patriarchal society. And so they implemented two instruments, so two things that would explain and try understand the non-randomness of a gender of a leader. And the two things were whether or not the previous monarch had a sister and whether or not the previous monarch had a firstborn male child. And they're pretty intuitive if you think about the way they impact each other. So, if the previous monarch has a firstborn son, that's going to decrease the likelihood that a queen is going to come to power. Pretty plain and simple. It's most of the time that the firstborn son will just be the heir and he will go on to be the following king. There's also the second kind of stipulation, which is if the previous monarch had a sister. And this basically means if they didn't have heirs or the heirs weren't suitable for the throne, which was a lot of the cases, then there's a chance that the sister would rule and become a queen. And so that obviously increases the likelihood that the next monarch is a queen. So now that they've kind of got a predictor of whether or not the gender of the leader is going to be determined by these succession rules, thereby being able to kind of understand the impact of these things, they can purely look at gender versus conflict. And I'll just shove up the empirical equation just here. And basically, as you can see, that there's a couple more little words which are a bit fancy. But basically, they just added control variables and fixed effects. So basically, control variables are just trying to control for unobservable things. Trying to really make sure that it's only gender and conflict that we're looking at. And fixed effects are basically just trying to isolate the geographical and time frame effects, because it's not always the same throughout a huge span. But basically, now that they've got this super concrete empirical strategy, let's look into the results they found. Let's see if gender has an impact on war. So let's look at the results. Is there a difference in conflict and peace versus queens and kings? Well, I'm going to shove table 3 up right now. And the main thing you want to look at is if you go top right corner and it's from the variable queen and down from in war brackets 4. And as you can see, and if you haven't really looked at many economics tables before, it's got a number and then a number in square brackets below it. I'll explain what they kind of mean. So basically, the number above is the difference between kings and queens. And you can see, it's 0.388 star. So the 2 stars mean it's significant. And this basically means that queens are around 40% more likely to be involved in a war than a king. So massive. That's after controlling for the non-randomness of ascension to the throne. That's after, having a super robust empirical strategy. That's pretty clear that those are the results. And the instruments, which are the things that predicted whether or not a queen would come to power, like the firstborn son and the sister, they're valid. So the results are super strong. So you're kind of sitting back and you're like, whoa, 40% is a lot. I think there might be cases for why a queen would be going to war more often. And the paper kind of outlines 4 cases. So the first case is that queens are perceived as weak. And so basically they're involved in more conflicts because people are attacking them because they go, hey, look, that country's got a queen as a ruler. They're weak. We're going to attack them. We're going to try to take over. So that's the first theory. Definitely a case for it. It makes a lot of sense. You feel like that could have happened in history pretty easily. The second one is that
they are influenced by their advisors. So this is under the assumption that advisors are more aggressive than queens, and this is kind of the assumption that the male advisors are more aggressive than the queen they are currently sitting under. And this basically is under the theory that since they are an advisor, and if a war goes positively, they gain a tremendous amount, they're more likely to push for wars than a queen. And this is also only under the assumption that women are, so queens are more susceptible to advisors than kings are, which is also super debatable. So that's kind of second theory. The third theory is that they're trying to show off their strength. A queen comes to power and they go, look, I know that everybody thinks I'm weak. I'm going to lash out. I'm going to try prove that I am not a weak ruling monarch. I'm going to preemptively attack and try solidify my reign. So that's the kind of third theory. And the final theory, which is my favorite one, and it's definitely got the highest case of, validity, is kind of the division of labor theory, or in my words, the husband theory. So basically what it means is that when a queen comes into power, she is often always married to somebody. And when looking at who she marries, often there might be a case for that the selection of the husband, the king regent, they select somebody who's quite aggressive and dominant to try show strength. And that comes into play in kind of one half of the theory, that since the queen is the ruler, they often will appoint their husband to the leader of the military. And the problem with that is now that there's a husband in a kind of second tier position to the queen, they feel emasculated by that, and they kind of feel like they need to prove themselves in a patriarchal society. Look, I'm going to go to war, I'm going to prove that I'm a manly man and I'm not just a husband of this really famous woman. So there's that theory that would definitely say, look, yeah, that's why queens go to war more often, is because the men that are kind of second fiddle in their lives want to prove themselves. So that's one half of the theory. The other half of the theory is kind of a more positive approach, is kind of the division of labor theory. And this basically means that if a king has a queen, the queen isn't really assigned to any role. She's kind of just, this is grossly oversimplifying things, and I'm not a historian, but they're generally they'll, entertain the court, and they won't have a major role because it's not really the societal standard. But if a queen comes into power, her husband is expected to take a role like the military, and now this gives the country a higher capacity to do things. Now there's two people working instead of one. There's two people that are, close, hopefully, who are communicating with each other and who can take advantage of this and pursue more conflicts because they have the capacity to pursue more conflicts. So those are the four theories, and let's just kind of dive into why maybe the theories might hold up and why they might not. So how do you even go about testing these theories? How do you use numbers throughout history to understand whether or not a queen was perceived as a weak target? And this is where it comes in being, just a really great and creative economist to try think of these kind of niche ways to test all these things, because surprisingly the authors tested them and they're pretty hard to kind of go against. Their tests for these theories are pretty solid, and when I was trying to think of things they could have done better, I would think of something that they didn't test and then scroll down to the next page and it would just be there. So this paper is amazing, super strong, super robust. So let's kind of just go down and see, what the tests show. So how could you test whether or not a queen was perceived as weak? Well, you can do this by looking at if they were attacked more, or they were the attacker. And they tested this in table 5, which basically, I'm just going to shove it up, if I haven't already. And this shows that the queen attacked more than a king and was attacked less, but that's not a significant result. The main thing is that if we look at polity attacked and queen, they're 40% more likely to attack than a king. And there's no effect on whether or not the gender impacts if a country was attacked. So, pretty crazy, and that kind of, deconstructs our theory that queens might have been an easy target. So now we can move on to the next kind of two theories, and their test is kind of clumped together because it's super, super smart. So I'll shove up table 8 here. And basically the next kind of two theories is that they're either susceptible to their power-hungry advisors, which is really shaky, kind of under the assumption that queens are more susceptible than kings, because they would have both advisors. And also this third theory is that their attackiness shows strength. And if these cases were true, we would expect queens to attack earlier in their reigns than later. We'd expect them to come out swinging, especially if the power-hungry advisors, because if we assume that queens are susceptible, we can also assume that queens are more susceptible when they're younger. They know less, they'd trust their advisors more. So surely they would attack earlier in their reign. And that wasn't the case. And also, if they were trying to show strength, they would attack earlier in their reign. But that wasn't the case. It shows that they're more likely to attack in the second half of their reign. So now our top 3 kind of mechanisms are kind of shaky. We can go to our final one, and the best one, and the one that finally has some really positive results. And it's outlined in, I'm just going to shove it up, it's outlined in table 6. And this basically shows a queen who is married and a queen who is not married, and whether or not they're likely to attack, or, trying to see the conflict rates in married and not married queens. And if we look at queen x married, it shows that they're nearly 60% more likely to attack than a king who is married. And it also shows they're less likely to be attacked if they are married. And this is evidence for our division of labor theory, or our belligerent male, feeling bad about himself theory. You can't really differentiate between the two. There's not really a case. And you can kind of, argue your way throughout. It could be that, the husband is feeling really, small in comparison to his powerful queen and wants to attack, or that, there's a division of labor. They have a higher capacity to attack. So they're the results from the study. Super cool results and a great paper. And if you want to kind of look at more of them, and there's further econometrics, I have an article, I'll link it below as well. And also I'll link the paper below. And so now I kind of just wanted to, have some loose conversation about the things that I took away from this paper. And the main thing I took away wasn't so much about understanding how the gender of a leader impacts if they go to war or not. Because in my opinion, I don't think there's not much of a gender thing. There could be, super aggressive female leaders. There could be super aggressive male leaders. And it's pretty impossible to say, why don't you just try elect the people? This is like a current thing. Why don't we just try elect people who aren't aggressive in foreign policy? But the main thing I kind of took out of this paper, and I think it's like a really great thing about this paper, is kind of understanding, if we're thinking about men feeling lesser than women and lashing out, that's a super important thing to understand, that if men are feeling, lesser than women, they'll try lash out. So that's a thing that we have to address by kind of, discussion and teaching, men that it's a normal thing to be second to a woman, because it's a normal thing to be second to anybody. It's not a gender issue. It's just a thing that you have to learn to cope with. And, kind of pushing equality amongst genders is really important, because in the past, like we've seen, if there isn't equality between genders, there's people dying, there's wars, and that's all because potentially somebody felt lesser than a woman. And that's the craziest part to me. That is like the main thing that needs being addressing. But anyway, I think that's about it. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. Feel free to watch some more videos on the channel, or I'll link my econometric review of the paper down below, which is a good read as well. Anyway, see you guys later.